Hello guys, I'm Modifier. I'm a Tower Heroes player, and today I'm going to tell you about modifiers, because they suck. If you didn't know, they basically nerfed them all during Halloween of last year, and we really haven't had any development since then besides more nerfs for what is useful. So, I've kind of been wondering for a while, how can we fix this? I've actually tried a couple methods in the past, but I've never really found anything that worked because it either felt like too strong of an adjustment or too weak of an adjustment. So what I did as of relatively recent is that I made a Google Docs with a bunch of information, both about the bosses and about the wave generation of all of the enemies. So now I can point at some evidence when I say that something is wrong. So today I'm gonna tell you about how enemy spawns work because I feel like that's useful information. Then I'll be going into both an analysis and a possible bouncing adjustment to both the enemy and boss modifiers of the game. Also briefly look at some of the other modifiers, as well as just give some extra modifier ideas, and lastly give just some of my final thoughts on other stuff. And if you'd like to view my Google Sheets that I've been working on, I'll be posting a link to that in the description. So, here we go. Now, before I get started with the enemy modifiers, I would like to first cover how the system exactly works. I feel like this is valuable information because not only does it apply to casual mode and adventure mode, but also every single game mode in Tower Heroes, so it'll be helpful to know even if you aren't particularly interested in modifiers. In case you aren't already aware, waves in Tower Heroes are automatically generated with an algorithm, and I'll be discussing this algorithm and what I've found out about it during my research. When starting the game, enemies that the game wants to use will be chosen from the enemy pool. When using modifiers, this will traditionally just add enemies to what I'll be calling a normal enemy pool. These will always show up no matter what you do, and they have to appear. However, there is also a chance that you add a modifier that contributes to the seasonal enemy pool. This will usually be Easter, Halloween, or Christmas enemies, and they'll only show up in their respective event. However, you can accidentally activate them, and I have no idea what causes this. In addition, there's also enemies in the seasonal pool that don't exactly belong there. Usually they're event enemies, but the event doesn't actually have like a corresponding event to it, so it makes no sense why they're here. Besides that, we now get to organize the enemy pool with what enemies we have already. The enemies will be split mostly across the 40 waves as evenly as the game can possibly do. This is seriously noticeable with smaller enemy mods. For example, Silent Sanctuary enemies only has 5 types of enemies, so it will split them up, introducing one every 8 waves. The algorithm will introduce new enemies sooner rather than later. So, if there was a situation where it could introduce 4 new enemies, then 3 new enemies, and repeat that, or introduce 3 enemies, then 4 enemies, it'll always opt for 4 and then 3 rather than 3 and then 4. The algorithm will lastly never introduce more than 2 new enemies unless there's over 40 enemies in the enemy pool. In that case, it'll only introduce up to 2 at a time, and then up to 3 at a time if there's over 80, and so on. As for what order the enemies are actually sent out, it really only depends on one thing: health points. Just lower number comes first, and higher number comes last. There is a few small buffers, such as about a 50 health point buffer for anything that is considered a hidden enemy, such as a ghost. And there's a smaller buffer for faster, speedier enemies. This is like barely noticeable, but it is a thing that exists. There does not appear to be an account for enemies that have multiple phases, causing them to have more health points, and there does not appear to be a health scaling factor involved when calculating this. There may be something for enemies that have an ability, but I personally couldn't find anything because a lot of things seem split up. So I don't believe there is, but if they do have an ability check, it's pretty small buffer. Using this information, we can make an idea of what a theoretical enemy pool would look like and what would be sent out during a specific wave. For example, I will be using this enemy pool and assuming it's wave 30 out of 40. Because of this, it can only use the first 3/4 of enemies, so these last 8 will be mostly ignored throughout creating the waves. Now, the game will choose one of 3 wave types to create. The first wave generation that can occur is going to be called a repeating pattern by me. This will occur by sending out the strongest possible enemy first. This is followed by the second strongest enemy that the game can spawn, and this continues until the game reaches a cutoff point. The game will only consider the enemies that it has already used to fill out the rest of the wave. Beyond this, some of the enemies can only be used once and are removed from consideration after the fact. Besides that, the game will just randomly pick enemies and then end the wave once all enemy slots are filled. This is a varying number depending on what wave it is. It'll rise up during the beginning of the game until about the halfway point and then start dropping down afterwards. The second type of wave generation will be called descending order. This starts the same way, spawning the strongest enemies and then going down until it fills out the last enemy slot. And then it will keep going beyond that. It'll just randomly choose a stopping point and then it can't use a cutoff point anymore, so it just ends the wave there. The last type of wave generation will be called early spawn. This fills out any way either as a repeating or a descending order. However, the game asks itself an extra question at the end. Considering it's wave 30 now, what is something that'll possibly spawn during wave 35? In our situation, this would be a giant sentry, so the game would spawn an extra giant sentry before ending the wave. This would actually not occur on wave 30 because it'll only happen on multiples of 3 after wave 10. So, wave generation of early spawn will also only use some of the enemies when using modifiers. Adventure mode and casual mode will use everything possible, but modifiers just choose a few or maybe even choose none at all. And besides a couple of exception of the rules that are listed right now on screen, that's about everything that I can find. Let's start by taking a look at the enemy modifiers individually. Now, we ideally want these to line up with both adventure mode and casual mode, so we'll be looking at some of those stats first. Castletown is one of adventure mode's weakest options, and it only makes you fight about 600,000 health points worth of enemies throughout the entire game. One of the stronger adventure mode sets, Canyon, only makes you fight about 900,000 health points throughout the game. And casual mode hard does live up to its name of being hard because it makes you fight well over 1,000,000 total health points throughout its entire runtime. Now, looking at these, we can determine a set for our individual enemy modifiers to follow. these are the numbers you would have to divide by in order to line up with these stats if you're only accounting for total health. You can see that some of these are sort of close, but some of these are also way off considering the rewards that the game currently hands out. And if you decide to use average health instead, it would only raise these numbers slightly. Now, maybe this is bad, but maybe it's because we're not using all of the enemy modifiers, because the game actually wants us to use multiple in a set, or rather the developers want us to do that. So what I did is I took some of the sets that I usually do for fun, and I put them in using the exact same calculation. And they just line up with adventure and casual mode stats now. I find this unfortunate because that means they are somewhat correct in that regard. However, I don't particularly like this. This actually causes a lot of descending order to show up. So this makes a lot of easy enemies that you've already defeated multiple times before continue to show up even though you're probably still easily defeating them. This also makes you lose the chance of seeing repeating pattern much more often, because you'll just have so many new enemies that show up, that being like 3, and then you'll have all these probably like 20 some enemies that you've seen before, and they're just about as easy as they were when you first defeated them. And that's about what I think for the enemy spawning mechanics. So we're going to talk about early spawns right now. For casual mode, I don't particularly like early spawns because of the random nature, it might just be a huge health gap between one early spawn and another. However, I'm particularly okay with adventure mode because usually it's always guaranteed, and usually it's something that you can always deal with at that time. Early spawns and modifiers, however, could use some work. You can see what I found in that regard right on screen right now. And from the looks of it, some of these are actually formatted really well. However, some of these just exist, and for the most part, most of these do not exist at all. Another thing, and the last thing I'll be covering, is the missing enemies of the groups. One thing that's common is that they'll just forget something is supposed to go in an enemy modifier. For example, Silent Sanctuary actually makes you have a really tough time with both big golems and aqua soldiers, and branches and giant golems are pretty popular too, not because they're hard, but because they're at least on the map. However, they are not like one of the major difficulty hurdles included in Silent Sanctuary or included in any matter. However, Branch and Aqua Soldier did get into cloudy enemies instead, so that's a thing, I guess. Desolate Desert Heart actually has the Ancient Spirit, which is a sort of golem boss. So you would expect that golems would be part of the enemy modifier as well. However, the enemy modifier only includes cactuses, Toroks, and I believe sandworms. So there's no golem representation besides the boss for some reason. Grand Garage does this really cool thing where it splits up the electric enemies on the easy and medium difficulties and puts radioactive slimes on the harder difficulties. However, this does not happen in the modifier, so it kind of just leaves radioactive staying in like a weird position where he doesn't really have anything to line up with him. He just has the electric slimes. And while you could argue that Shade has the gym rat, I do kind of miss the chaos that multiple gym rats at the end of the game would cause in Abandoned Alleyway. And they also are just missing Hydrant Stump, so I guess there's that. As I have established, I'm not exactly a fan of descending order since it just sends out all the weak enemies without any new strong ones. However, I'm not exactly a fan of repeating either because it sends out all the strong ones at once and then some. So what is a good spawning mechanic? I'm going to suggest adding a new generation method to work alongside descending and repeating patterns so that we can have a more fair experience while also still sending out stronger enemies. I will be creating a new system called grouping. This will consist of all the regular enemies that the game would choose during an enemy pool, but not immediately considering them as part of the generation. Instead, we were going to first split them into groups. These actually already exist in a form through both daily challenges and the followers category, so we can start pulling from those. And in addition, we can also find enemies that have similar traits to each other and use those to form new types of groups. From this, we can take one group and then select 5 enemies from each of those groups, with the strongest one being at the end. We'll repeat this for maybe 2 to 7 groups depending on the wave number, and then that'll be the wave, unless we do want to do an early spawn, and then we can actually draw from one of the groups that we're already referencing. I feel like this would not only look more natural, but also be helpful in balancing the wave without sending out too many weak enemies or strong ones at the same time. I would also suggest adjusting some of the enemies. This is mostly just stuff that's missing in the modifier or doesn't belong there. So I just am trying to take liberties to remove and add those. And most importantly, I'm going to go all out on the early spawns. This is where I feel casual mode struggles the most in terms of modifiers because it doesn't really do early spawns a lot of the time. And if it's supposed to be hard, we're going to make it hard. And with all of my changes, I feel comfortable raising the modifier multipliers, but maybe not too much. So I'm hoping these will work out. I'm hoping we can ideally have like 3 to 4 at a time because that's generally where I find the most challenging sets in the current state of the game. And these are some additional changes that I would make. Some of them are smaller, but some of them are larger, such as turning Naughty's Resort into a buggy battle sort of situation, and maybe completely revamping Radiant's Reef into an aquatic invasion of some sort, since we haven't had one of those in a while. When it comes to boss modifiers, it's actually much easier to compare their rewards than to enemy modifiers because it's only one boss as opposed to 40 entire waves. When it comes to it, there's really only one question that you need to ask yourself, and that would be, don't you think there's some easier boss that you can defeat instead? Whenever you're defeating one boss at a time, there's really only 5 modifiers that you'll ever need to consider because they're so much easier than their competition. These are listed on screen right now, and we're going to compare them to some other bosses that either have the same rewards but very different stats, or similar stats but very different rewards. For the zero point 0.6 reward range, you have both Whisper and Bloxer, one being more difficult to obtain because Mythic modifier, but they're both pretty easy. On the other hand, you have Figure, who actually doubles the health points, and usually more in higher difficulties, but is still given the same zero point 0.6 multiplier for a reward. Tinker is in a similar situation where he has more health points than both bosses, but he's also faster this time and is able to stun your heroes by using clocks. The Royal Snails, on the other hand, are stronger and faster than both Whisper and Bloxer, but they actually score a zero point 0.5 instead of a zero point 0.6 this time. So for some reason, the harder boss is lower. For the easiest bosses of the zero point 0.7 range, we have Mirai. Kinda decent health points, so you can still do it pretty easily, and the ability that forces Synth and Charge to spawn on wave 30 isn't exactly helpful for her because you're well equipped to deal with those by the time it spawns in. On the other hand, we have Shade, who has more health points and more speed, plus he's able to spawn the Gym Rat on wave 20 as opposed to wave 30. However, he is still given the same 0.7 multiplier. We also have the Goblin Captain at a 0.55. However, he has more than double health points to Mirai in all difficulties, and still matches the exact same speed. He even is able to stun heroes with a ranged attack in the form of his cannon. A similar situation to that is Bee Queen, who is also able to stun your heroes, albeit with bees instead of a cannon. And she has more health points and slightly more speed than Mirai. However, she is still given the same 0.7 reward. So some of these are clearly stronger, but I guess Mirai is just easier to defeat. So for the 0.8 reward range, we have the Mega Sentries. They're getting a bit better in terms of health points, however the speed is really not helping them. Chaos Sentry does make up a bit for this with the giant sentry summon, but that's about it. A lot of the bosses in this range have a lot more speed than Mega Sentry. For example, Colbert actually has about double speed compared to the Mega Sentries in most situations. He only sacrifices a little of health points in this regard, and even has more health points than the Mega Sentry on easy difficulty. So it's kind of odd how they're the exact same reward. You can also say this about the Easter Eggland bosses. They also share the fact that they have slightly less health points, but they are much faster to compensate. Well, not much faster, but still fast enough to notice. Plus, Amor is nearly double as strong as the Chaos Sentry, and is able to stun your heroes as opposed to distracting them with the Giant Sentry, but he's still given the 0.8. I'm also going to compare this to the Ghost Magician, which is high, but I actually don't particularly agree with this. Ghost Magician himself is fine, because, like, the 5001 speed is decently stronger than the 60,000.5 speed. However, Grim Reaper and Overgrown Stump are much weaker than the Mega Sentry counterparts, and don't really have much of a speed increase to compensate for that. So I actually don't agree with them being slightly higher. For the ×1 reward area, one of the easiest options is casual bosses. This is specifically because Corrupted Knight is super slow and has the same amount of low health points as the Mega Sentries had. He really is only able to stun nearby heroes. On the other hand, Void Reaper is actually a very tough fight, and Sylvia is actually kind of bounced where she is right now. Most of the ×1 bosses that get up here, I feel don't belong up here. For example, there is the Ancient Spirit. Yes, it is stronger than the Corrupted Knight, but that's about it. The medium and hard mode variants are way too weak in their first phase because you can pretty much get rid of them easily. And from that, it just ends up being a slow slog through the second phase, which is much weaker than the casual boss's counterparts. Skull Temple is in a similar situation. Very strong easy difficulty, but lackluster medium and hard mode difficulty. being less health points than the casual counterpart. However, he is able to buff every single other boss enemy with the extra health point multiplier, which actually is fairly unbalanced for like 1% more reward, which is why I think we should remove this, as you'll see later. And the Pumpkin Reaper, fairly weak, but he is actually really fast, so that is something that is going for him. However, if you race the two, he will actually get beaten by Mailboy to the exit, and Mailboy is a zero point 0.4 if I'm not mistaken. So even if Pumpkin Reaper is able to stun your heroes, he doesn't really have a lot going for him besides that. And for the times 1.1 reward bosses, I stated that the easiest is Mothership. You can kind of see this simply in the easy mode variant where it's only 70,000 health points, and the ability is lackluster, only simply summoning an alien one time as opposed to anything more difficult. Also of 1.1 is the Blast Touch Brawler, and you can already see that the health points are way more up there than Mothership's is. He also is able to punt to the ground, which causes your heroes to get stunned, which is much more than the Mothership ever did. And while Demise, the last 1.1 in the game, is usually weaker than the Mothership and is definitely slower, he is also able to stun your heroes at nearly all times and is even able to downgrade them, which is frankly something that you probably don't want to deal with. The Mothership is going to always be the best option. However, the adventure bosses also exist, but I feel like they got up there by pure luck. Necromancer is honestly just an easier version of Tiny Crew, which is just given a higher reward for some reason. Fort Rock is actually more comparable to a point 0.7 boss with less health points. And Conquer is okay, but in regards to other similar bosses, he would probably need his health points doubled to make any sense. That being said, this isn't the only use for bosses. They don't have to be used alone. They can also be used in boss rushes. However, this actually makes your rewards worse. You actually need more than 4 bosses to usually raise your enemy bonus to a high enough level for it to be meaningful. And with that, you're basically killing any chance that you had to use actual enemies for the enemy bonus. Even if you didn't do this, you would have to either handle casual hard modes enemies, which I've already discussed as being not really fair, or you'd have to fight not only what you just put in there, but also a adventure mode boss with it, which they don't contribute at all to the enemy bonus, so the fact that they're about the same is kind of weird. And lastly, there is a counter argument that you could get huge rewards by using huge amounts of bosses in the boss modifier area. And yes, this does look promising, giving you about 150 coins. However, even though I'm using the highest possible bosses that you can use, one of them is Last Touch Brawler, and you have to remember that you can just play as challenge mode variant for just barely a less amount of coins than the modifier variant. So yeah, boss rushes really aren't very useful. In order to balance the boss modifiers properly, I think we need to change things. Boss modifiers currently contribute to the same enemy bonus that enemy modifiers do, and this frankly doesn't help either of them. So I'm going to suggest a new boss bonus system that could be added instead so we can separate the two. And instead of multiplication, we're going to use addition to boost them up. We can give each boss modifier a base value that it'll assign to the game by default. However, if there's a stronger boss present, it'll use an additional value instead that it just adds on to the current boss bonus instead of using multiplication to probably reduce the rewards. This will help us reduce the chance of lowering the rewards whenever we add extra bosses, which frankly never makes sense. And besides, this idea actually helps us target bosses that are really easy on their own but difficult in groups. For example, there's some bosses like Mailboy who can be very fast but easy to deal with. However, in a boss rush, this will let slower bosses catch up and possibly stun heroes. A unique situation in this also Krampus. He actually is way too weak to justify giving a larger reward. However, if he trails behind someone, he's actually really difficult to deal with because of his summons. And generally, I think ranged bosses should have more of an advantage here than melee bosses when it comes to stunning your heroes because it's doing it anywhere versus needing to be right next to the heroes to stun. And I think that requires a high reward than just treating everything equally as it sort of does now. If you didn't know, it kind of just gives everything a plus 14 right now if you take the multiplicative system, so it's kind of weird. One other complaint I have, though not necessarily a thing that needs to be fixed, there's a lot of bosses that just sort of walk forward and do nothing else, or even just summon something and do nothing else. And I think that's a formula we use way too often, and we should work to redo some of that, if you will. We could also rework some of the older boss attacks because some of them don't make sense, such as how Mega Sentry fires a beam that summons a regular sentry for some reason. So these are the base values and the additional values I think we should adjust to the bosses. These are higher than as currently going, but that's also because the additional rewards from the multiplication system will be way down in compensation. And on this other changes slide, there are some mild health reworks, but there's also a bunch of attack reworks that I think we could use to readjust some of those bosses that just kind of walk forward and do nothing. So yeah, that's about what I have to say about bosses. When looking at the modifiers that we haven't already discussed, there's really only one question you need to ask yourself again. And that would be, do you think this modifier is really worth doing? In a lot of cases, there tends to be an easier alternative that you could do instead, either for more rewards or for easier difficulty overall. For example, you can choose between position swap, which is going to swap all of the hero positions every wave, but it's really easily countered by placing everything near the track instead of the traditional placement. Or you could do hero elimination for the exact same reward. There, they delete one of your heroes every single wave, at least, and you can't really counter this unless you literally have nothing on the field, which isn't very helpful for defeating enemies at all. You have both no enemy mana or no wave mana, which will multiply your rewards by a very generous amount in exchange for cutting one of your mana sources completely off. Or you could do less mana, which halves your sources from both, or use pricey heroes, which effectively makes your mana half as effective. And both of these are only worth like 2% more rewards as opposed to like 20%-ish, which doesn't seem very fair considering the huge difference for the same effective gameplay. Flooded is actually really easy because there's some maps that you can just place as you normally would and like your strategy won't change at all even if it's flooded. Lava actually provides a unique placement challenge in every single map that I've played it with. However, it rewards the exact same as flooded, which is really easy. However, like there's not all these comparison modifiers that you can make. Some of these you have to judge for yourself. Stronger enemies is 15% more rewards, but the enemies receive more health. Maybe this isn't worth it to you, but it is worth it to me. You can also use snow minions raid to get beat up by snowmen. Maybe getting nothing for this besides the usual reward is worth it to you, but it's not to me. So I kind of just adjusted these according to what I think is hard and what I think is easy in that sort of regard. There's also a lot of cosmetic modifiers that are kind of obvious, so I just didn't touch those at all and just put them to the side. And I did start making some changes to the modifiers, but about part way through, I kind of just realized that I really only care about some of these. And honestly, skipping over the remaining ones would be fine in my opinion. This last section of the slideshow just covers some other ideas I had that don't particularly pertain with the other topics that I've already discussed. First of all, I feel like stronger bosses modifier in particular should utilize the stronger attacks that it advertises more often. As you can see from the green text on this slide, a whole lot of them do not end up using it, and it's only a select few. So I feel like we should slightly raise the reward up as I showed before, and then use these stronger attacks to compensate. A lot of these are relatively new, but you can also just, scripting wise, just you can solve one and then you can probably reuse the code to fix the rest of them. Another thing I had was some new modifier ideas. These are mostly me trying to fill out the maps that don't have modifiers or have duplicates, such as Chaos Kingdom and Facility Raid. But there are some unique shop modifier ideas that I had too, so they are up on here. And lastly, I think the modifier shop should receive a rework with a pity system because a lot of modifiers are not cosmetics. So I suggest adding a fourth modifier slot that's considered featured and always contains something that you don't own at the expense of a lot more money than it would usually cost to buy it. And yeah, that's about it. Alright, this last section will be a lot less scripted than the other sections. I mostly just want to discuss things that I probably haven't discussed during this entire segment. I just would like to touch on some of the more recently updated modifiers first. Of course, we have Halloween enemies, that should be obvious. However, this one hasn't really changed in much regard as to before. I think it like got slightly easier, but I still think it's about the same, to be honest. And something else I didn't account for, ice types actually might have gotten up updated due to the title takedown popsicles. However, I can't really retest this because of ICO's messing up the data. So I guess if I come to a consensus about either of those while I'm editing this, I'll just like slap it on the side of the screen. However, if I don't slap anything there, I just didn't think of anything. As for the new Halloween modifiers, I don't really have much to say about them. I think Ringmaster needs a hard lower. He makes other bosses easier, but the others should be slightly more up there. I guess if I have anything else to say, like if I think about it more, I'll put them to the side again. But again, if I don't place anything there, I just wasn't thinking of it. And I guess there's ability spam too, I'll also address it there. That being said, I don't think there's much new going on. Something else I would like to touch on is like the seasonality sort of stuff. Like, I guess this isn't directly related to modifiers, but I know how I said like some enemies will be relegated to like Easter or Halloween or Christmas or just a event that may or may not exist in the case of crossovers. I don't really like this system. I don't know if I said that already, but I just don't like it. Like, first of all, you can accidentally activate it, so like, what's the point of restricting them behind their modifiers during the season? Second of all, I can't even buy them, so even if I grinded them, I couldn't do that. And third, they kind of just make the yearly modifier like inconsistent, which I don't like. So I really don't think seasonality should be a thing. I just wanted to say that. And I guess there's one last thing I would like to touch on. The reason for modifiers. Like, why do I want to be using modifiers? The answer can't be money because last ditch barrage is always going to be like a better option. And it could be fun, but I'm not going to count that because like anything could be for fun. I'm going to grind turkey this week for fun, and that's not really fun. So what can I use modifiers for? Is it for grinding followers? Okay, I can't do that below ×1, and I could do that in plenty of challenge mode maps, which is probably worth less than one, so that'd be done. Is it for rewards? No, casual mode doesn't give rewards, and neither does adventure mode, at least not yet. I think it's supposed to, but we're not there yet. Is it for mimics? Again, I could probably have an easier time grinding mimics in their respective maps. Corporate Chaos 0.45 versus actual Corporate Chaos. Radiant Reef 0.75 versus actual Radiant Reef. Beach enemies 6.0.65. And you kind of get my point. It's just usually worth you have to add more or you can't grind the mimic. So again, what's the point? So really, I just struggle to see why I should use modifiers. I'm just going to have an easier time not using them. And like, yes, for fun, that's still a valid point, but I don't really like the idea of that being the only valid point. Like, is there really nothing else? I would like to discuss more about this, but I'm kind of just blanking on ideas, so I think that's where I end this section. So, yeah, I don't see the point in using modifiers, and I don't see the point in seasonality, and I think that's about it. Yeah. And I guess that's everything I have to say about modifiers. There are several other issues that I could look into when it comes to Tower Heroes. I do have some problems with some hero balancing and some map balancing that I would also like to talk about. But frankly, that doesn't feel like my job. I feel like there are many other people who are much more qualified in talking about that sort of thing than I am. So just hopefully the data sheet that I have decided to provide for you in the description is better than me figuring out that the maximum amount of turkey kills for the follower is 10,000. But if you like the modifier video, you can choose to like the video. You can also share it if you feel like someone would find the information valuable, or you can comment if you feel something is wrong or if you want to add on to something that I said. Try not to subscribe because I don't know if I'm going to keep doing this type of content though. And that's about it. So, in conclusion, we need to fix the emotes menu. Just look at this. Can you believe this doesn't work? We need to fix this like right now.